welcome to Real Life. We're really glad that you're here. I want to welcome everybody here. Thank you. Whether you're at the Valencia location inside or outside, whether you're watching online from all over the world, or whether you're watching at our Canyon Country location, we are so glad that you're joining us in week 4 of Is God Fake News? And I just want to remind you, next weekend, it's a big weekend around here. It's kind of a holy weekend. It's not Christmas or Easter, but it is Super Bowl Sunday. That's a big deal, okay? It's a big deal for us. And so you got to wear your jersey, whether it's, for the Patriots, or whether it's for the Eagles, or whether it's for another football team, or West Ranch lacrosse. It doesn't matter. You wear your jersey however you want to wear it. That would be awesome. And we're all going to celebrate and have a lot of fun. And we're going to have a lot of prizes, a lot of giveaways. And we're going to have a great, great experience together. So do not miss it. I know Super Bowl weekend gets crazy, and you got party plans and people coming over. So get in here early, get into one of our services, maybe come on Thursday night, whatever it is, and make sure that you are with us as we celebrate this great time together and have a great, great service. So that's next weekend. And this is also a great time to bring a friend, okay? If you're thinking, well, I don't think I'll bring a friend on Super Bowl Sunday, it's a great time to bring a friend because we're going to have a lot of fun. There'll be church like they've never experienced it before, and then you can take them home to your Super Bowl party. And then, maybe if you don't like them, you just drop them off somewhere else. Whatever the case, but you just kind of decide along the way and have a great time. Okay, so today we are concluding our 4-part series called Is God Fake News? And this is kind of the premise we've been working with for this entire 4-part series. And that is that all of us fall into category 1 at some point in our life. And for most of us, we have grown up in some kind of situation where we were told there is a God. And maybe you just learned this growing up, or you watched people pray over Thanksgiving dinner or Christmas dinner, or people would talk about it, or maybe you watched the Grammys and somebody, gave props to their homie Jesus and God and everything, and you kind of go, there must be something bigger than us. And so you kind of grew up thinking about that, or you kind of grew up thinking that there was a God, and then something in your life happened. You changed friends, you changed schools, you went away to college, you met a new group of people, and they didn't believe what you believed, and it made you question what you believe. And maybe you just began to experience a new way of living that didn't have all the rules you grew up with. Maybe you went to Christian school or Catholic school and you got out of the house and you just ran wild and you thought, maybe there isn't this belief system that I grew up in. Maybe it was just for kids. Maybe I did grow out of it like I did so many other beliefs I had as a kid. And you moved out of that category. You just took a step away from it. Now, some of us have gone so far as to come clear over to this category. Category number 2, there is no God. And you may be watching this because you've been curious about this throughout this series, or you're watching this right now, or you're in a room right now listening to this because, you are coming with somebody else and they don't even know that you've moved in this category, but you're not sure if there's a God. And there's a part of you that's kind of thinking, I don't think there is. I look at the difficulties in the world. I look at the natural calamities in the world. I see the way everything's spinning out of control, and I think there can't be a God. But there's something about that makes you a little uncomfortable, because all of us kind of like having a God that we can pray to when we're in trouble, or we can blame when things don't go right. And so we just get a little bit creeped out by the whole thing of thinking this is all just science and metaphysics. And so we don't want to go all the way over here, so we end up somewhere in between. And we land in this nebulous region of not so convinced there's a God, but I'm not so convinced there isn't. I don't like the doubt of category 1, but I don't like the despair of category 2. And so you've been stuck here in the middle. I have been so appreciative of the emails and the texts and the Facebook messages and the conversations I have had with people throughout this series who have told me, I didn't think this series was going to be for me, but now I know it was exactly for me. Because I've been in that middle camp for a while and I just didn't recognize it. And maybe I've been feeling that for a while. Maybe you've only caught one of these messages, or maybe you've got a friend that feels that way but would never come to church. And all the stuff we're talking about through this series is on this website called isgodfakenews.com. And in just a few days, this final message will be up there as well. And you can send it to everybody, and it'll be up there as long as there is an internet. And make sure to get that out to people so they can experience it. Now, here has been the goal of the entire series. If you have been in category 1 and you took a step away from believing in a God to a point where you don't know where you fit anymore, my hope, my prayer for you is that you start asking questions, that you bring all your skepticism, you bring even your cosmology, your skepticism, your questions about the Old Testament miracles and the Bible and six-day creation and all those kind of things, and you take a step back to there is a God. And I know there are some of you right now that are thinking, well, I kind of think that, and maybe there is a God, but I don't like organized religion. Listen, I get it. I understand this. I'm in the profession. Let me just tell you, you know what's worse than organized religion? Disorganized religion, okay? That's even worse, all right? Think about Waco. Let's just go there. I mean, it gets really crazy. So that's not what we're asking you to do. I'm not asking you to accept a church. I'm not asking you to accept a dogma or a doctrine. I'm asking you just to take a step back towards perhaps there is a God that deserves another look and is okay with your questions. And let me just be really honest with you here. For those of you that are skeptics, we need you. And here's why. You keep us honest. Because if you grow up in a faith system and you're good with it, it becomes very easy to start just pushing the faith button for everything. How did that happen? I just believe it. Why did we do that? I just believe it. And you don't even think through the process anymore. And we need those of you with questions. And maybe you started going to a church at some point in your life and you started asking some of these questions and people just freaked out on you. I mean, you just wanted to know about the six-day creation, and they suddenly thought, oh, no, you've got a demon inside of you, and they're laying hands on you right there in the coffee shop and casting things out, and they're like, I'm done with this, and you're walking away. And I get it if that's you and you've stepped away from that. I just want to invite you back because I think there is so much we gain by you asking your questions. And this has always been a place where skeptics are allowed. And questions only make us better because we believe that we do serve a God that is the God of the answers. And we will begin to wrestle with these things together, but it only happens if you take a step back and be a part of us. So I just want to invite you back. Here's another little group I want to talk to, and then we'll get to how we're going to wrap this series up. I want to talk specifically to all of the dads. If you're a dad, and you have decided at some point in your life to take a step away from God, and as a result, you are going to drag your family with you, can I just ask you, would you reconsider that? Please don't let your adult skepticism rob your children of a foundation that will serve them for their life. Now, I know what you're thinking. A few people clapped on that one. All the ladies clapped on that one. Thank you. Okay. I know your pushback, which is, I don't want to tell my kids something I don't even believe in. I get it. But there are things that you maybe have grown out of, but you've got to admit, if you grew up in any kind of church setting, there are some fundamental values you learned. Even if you're not sure what you think about the Bible or God or Jesus, there are some fundamental values you learned about patience or kindness or love or joy or peace that have served you well in your life. Do not rob your kids of that experience. And I know the popular thing is for everybody to say, well, I'm just going to let my kids decide for themselves. Okay, that's cool, but you don't do that with math. You don't do that with brushing their teeth. And so when it comes to something this important, which I think is eternal. You may not, but you've got to admit it's values that are good for your family. Don't rob them of that just because you're an adult skeptic. And so if you're in that camp, I encourage you to stay with us. One, for your own sake, but two, for your family's sake as well. So here's what I'm asking you to do. For anybody who finds himself in that nebulous in-between region, between doubt and despair, between there is a God and there isn't a God, I'm just asking you to take a step. Just take one step back. Decide to join a group and talk more about it. Get into a rooted group. Get into a life group. Decide to investigate, celebrate recovery. Decide to pick up a Bible and start reading it instead of just saying you don't believe in it. Download an app and start reading it. Start asking some of those questions. Start dialoguing with people around here and get your answers for your faith. Because we believe that you can belong long before you believe. And here's why I say that. Because the people that followed Jesus, there was a time they didn't believe. And Jesus said, follow me, and they were still skeptical. And then they became believers, and then Jesus died, and none of them were believers. And then Jesus came back, and they started believing again, and then they changed the world. And if you think you've got to have all the answers and got it all figured out, friends, none of us will ever get there. Belong before you believe, and we'll take this journey together. So, here's how we're going to wrap this up today. What I want to do is I just want to talk to all of those who have just kind of stepped away from faith, and you find yourself in that nebulous region. And here's what I want to ask you to do today. I want to ask you to be very, very honest with yourself. I don't mean honest like you are on January the 3rd and you're done with the New Year's resolutions. I don't mean honest when you look at the scale and you think it's broken. I don't mean honest like I really don't feel like I should go work out today. I mean honest with yourself about something. Because when I'm really honest with myself, I have to humble myself, and humility does not come natural for any of us. Because something that all of us have learned is this art of self-deception. The problem is when we deceive others, it's one thing. When we deceive ourselves, we never make any progress. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do for the remainder of our time together. And you don't even have to say this out loud. This is just between you, or between you and God. I'm going to ask you to be honest with yourself about a set of questions I'm going to ask you here in just a second. And here's why I know that the reason so many of us get stuck in our life is because of self-deception. Think about it like this. Think about how different your life would be if one of your parents would have been honest with themselves. If your dad would have been honest that he had a drinking problem. If your mom would have been honest that she had a prescription pill problem. I mean, some of us, our entire lives would have been different if somebody just would have been honest with themselves. Think about perhaps a relationship you were in. You might still be married if one of you had been honest with yourself. You might have a different relationship with your kids if you had been honest with yourself. You see, this really is the issue that many of us have, and I need to quit making excuses and take responsibility, not just for my life, but even for my faith and my beliefs. So here's my challenge for you over the next few moments. Will you just be honest with yourself about why it is you believe what you believe? Okay, and this, like I said, you don't have to tell anybody around you. Just to be honest with yourself. Now, that may come across as a little bit insulting, so let me just explain what it is I'm talking about, okay? I'm going to give you 3 quotes, and then I'm going to give you a question, and then I'm going to put it all together for us, all right? Here's what this has to do with anything. Let me draw your attention to this book right here. This is a book by an atheist by the name of Thomas Nagel. He's also a professor at New York University. He teaches philosophy and law. He wrote this book called Mind and Cosmos, but it's the subtitle that got him into a lot of trouble with other atheists. Why the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. He stole the title to my next book. That's what I was going to write. I mean, that just rolls off the tongue, right? I mean, the subtitle alone really makes you scratch your head on this. But here's what he does in this book, which really made the people in his community angry. He calls out the atheists, and he says, you know what? We do the same thing that the religious people do, that we bash them for. And that is that we, as an atheist community, bash the religious community for having a God of the gaps. When they can't figure out something, they just say, well, God did it. God did it. We don't know. God did it. And he said, you know what? As atheists, we do the same thing with natural selection. We can't figure it out. Missing link. Don't understand it. Natural selection, natural selection, natural selection. He says, we cannot have a double standard there. And it really got him into a lot of trouble. Now, in this book, he begins to talk about that all of us have some kind of a value system, and he begins to get at, where does this come from? Because he's an atheist, and he's really wondering why. Now, it's in his book earlier called The Last Word that I want to give you a quote, and I think this just might be liberating for some of you, just to put some words around what it is that you may be feeling when it comes to the reason you have stepped away from a belief in God. Here's what he says: I want atheism to be true. He's an atheist, believes in natural selection, and he says, I want it to be true. And I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. You hear the tension in what he's saying here? I want atheism to be true, but I know a lot of really good, smart people that believe otherwise. And then he continues, it isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. Now let's just dig into that for just a little bit. Is there anything about what he just said there that makes you go, that's what I'm feeling? He says, I'm an atheist. I hope I'm right, but let's be really honest. I don't want there to be a God. And when we started this whole conversation 4 weeks ago and started talking about what if there really is a God, it's just different than you thought, there's a part of you that just is terrified to cracking open that door to that possibility. Because if you open that door to that thought, it opens up the door to something that you're smart enough to know. And that is, if I open up that door, I may never close it again. The difference, what he's talking about here is, and this is what we got to wrestle to the ground, is what is the reason why you've stepped away from belief in God? Is it because you don't believe it or because you don't want to believe it? And there's a big difference. I don't believe it is, I used to believe it, something happened, I read something, I discovered something, I found something, and now I don't believe it anymore. Okay? But I don't want to believe it is everything to do about your will. I don't want to believe it because. I don't want to believe it because. I don't want the universe to work that way. Those are two different things. I mean, think about it. Did you lose your faith over something that you read? Did you lose your faith over a science experiment and maybe something or information that wasn't there? Or did you take a step back because, understand this, did you walk away from faith because it became inconvenient? In other words, you went away to college and you joined in a lifestyle that faith was no longer congruent with or convenient. And so you decided to stop believing, and then you had to go pick up some excuses as to why. There's a big difference between I don't believe and I don't want to believe. Because if you just don't believe, guess what? There's answers out there that you can get. There's studies you can do. There's research you can find to answer your deepest questions or your greatest, kind of arguments against faith. But most of us who've stepped away from God have done so because we just don't want God. We don't want to believe in God. And at some point in our life, our faith became inconvenient. Let me give you a second quote. This comes from a 17th century philosopher, mathematician named Blaise Pascal. And maybe you've heard about him, maybe you had to read him in high school or college. He's a brilliant, brilliant individual, a child prodigy, died very young, but we're still talking about some of the things that he says. And take a look at this quote. He says, people almost invariably arrive at their beliefs, catch this is brilliant, not on the basis of proof, but on the basis of what they find attractive. In other words, none of us are on a truth quest. I mean, we like to say we are. We like to say, I'm just looking for answers. But the reality is most of us don't wake up in the morning and say, I will abandon all my beliefs, all my thoughts, all my hopes and dreams just to find the truth, whatever the truth is. I mean, unless you're Fox Mulder and you're searching for the X-Files, most of us typically don't say that. And if you do, you're probably not a lot of fun to hang around with, right? Most of us are not on a truth quest. We're on a happiness quest. I want to be happy. And then whatever the values are that come with that, I'm into. I want to be happy, and whatever the belief system I have to have around that to make it possible, I'm fine with that. And what we do is we move towards happiness like a moving target, and then we change our worldview, and we change our philosophy and our belief to accommodate that happiness. And it works fine till we're no longer happy. Because what really is going on for us, back to this Blaise Pascal quote, is we are not arriving at our beliefs basically on proof. We're arriving at our beliefs on the basis of what we find attractive. Why is it you took a step away from faith? Is it because you found something else more attractive? All right. Let me give you one other one here. And that is from St. Augustine. Look what he says. We love the truth when it enlightens us, and we hate the truth when it convicts us. I mean, isn't that the case for all of us? We love the truth when we're right. I mean, think about this in the terms of an argument, all right? When you were a kid and you were arguing with your parents, usually about halfway through that argument, you figured out, oh yeah, I'm wrong. But did you quit? Did you stop and go, you know what, Mom, you got a point there. That is brilliant. In fact, I'm going to write that down. That is really good. I'm sorry and thank you. And I'll go ground myself for a couple weeks for what I just said. No, we don't do that. We keep at it. And the good news is we grow out of that, don't we? Of course not. We get married. And then we find somebody that we can verbally go at all the time. And we just prove that we're right. And here's another thing, and here's another thing. And I'm going to have the first word, the middle word, and the last word. And I'm going to talk over you and all through it. And I'll talk while you're asleep and still be right. And you know this, right? I mean, guys especially, aren't there times that our wives, they just say something, just a zinger, and you go, oh, that was really good, And if I wasn't so mad, I'd probably high-five you for that because you're right. But there's something in us that goes, I cannot lose. I will not admit that I am wrong, and I will act like the truth is on my side even when it is not. Why do we do that? Isn't there something inside all of us that regardless of the facts, we just want to be right, and sometimes we just don't want to believe what it is they're saying is true? So there's our three quotes. That's what the big issue is for all of us. And so here's my question I want us just to wrap this whole series up with, and that is this. What is it that causes you to not want to believe? If you've taken a step away from faith, what is it that causes you to not want to come back? Can I just give you three possible options that might be for you? Because I know these are things I wrestle with too. Here's the first one. If there's a God, then I'm guilty. I mean, could it be, because all of us have things in our past that we're not really proud of, that it could be kind of embarrassing? Maybe some of us have made it such a big deal about our disbelief in God. If we have to admit there is a God, there's a little bit of crow to eat, and you feel like, man, I've just really made a fool of myself. And you feel ashamed, you feel embarrassed. And yet, what happens is when you admit there's a God, there's this sense of, if I do that, now I got to deal with all the mistakes I've made in the past. And you kind of got over those by saying, well, I was young, or I didn't know any better, it was just a mistake I made. But the problem is, it's no longer just a mistake. Maybe I sinned. And maybe it's a realization that your big mistake actually can't be paid back. you actually hurt some people, or you owe somebody something, and you can't pay back a childhood or a first marriage, or you can't give back to your kids what they should have had in a mother or a father, and there's some things you can't reconcile, you can't make right. And of course, I understand this in our culture, and we just keep pushing back and we say, well, I made a mistake, nobody's perfect, it's no big deal. But suddenly, if I admit there's a God, and this is what terrifies us and why we don't want to crack that door open, because if I admit there's a God, then I'm guilty by his standards. And so there's a part of us that say, I'm just going to assume there's not a God. Friends, that's not evidence. That's just an excuse. And here's the second thing that might be why we aren't really wanting to believe in a God. If there's a God, then I'm accountable. I mean, this is the story of the Garden of Eden right here. Whether you believe it to be true or false or a myth or actual, the reality is the story of the Garden of Eden is the most brilliant thing we could ever look at, because it is our lives. It is two people deciding we're going to do our own thing autonomous from God. It is a story of two people not wanting to be accountable to anyone. And the problem with that is when two people decide not to be accountable and then they decide to be in a relationship with one another, it has devastating reactions to their relationship and to other people around them. Unaccountable people always make regretful decisions. And if I admit there's a God, then suddenly I have a standard to live up to, and I'm accountable for my actions. And so here's what we do. We don't want to believe that, so we just live really loud and busy and crazy lives so we don't have to think about how we're accountable. Maybe that's your story. But that's not a reason not to believe in God. That's just an excuse. And here's the third one. If there's a God, then I must admit I've been wrong. I would talk so big about how there wasn't a God, or I don't believe, and I had all these little excuses as to why. But the reality was, it wasn't the excuses that led me into not believing. It was a decision I made that it became just inconvenient, and then I came up with some excuses to kind of make everybody else run away when I throw those out. The reality is, if I believe in God, then I have to admit I'm wrong. And that's where that H word comes in, humility. And friends, ordinarily, I mean, if we weren't even talking about this, you would say humility is a great virtue because it helps you to learn. It helps you to put yourself underneath somebody else's wisdom. It helps you to grow in your life and become a better person. But suddenly, when it comes to this issue, we don't want humility. And so here's what we do. We just back away and we just say, I'm just going to stick with my arguments and keep God at bay. Friends, those aren't arguments for or against anything. They're just responses to the fact that we don't want to be guilty, and we don't want to be accountable, and we don't want to be wrong. For some of you, isn't it true that your arguments against God came after your decision to not want God? You went away to college. You got involved in a relationship. Everybody said, don't get involved in it. You know, you just stopped going to church, and then you started building a reason for it afterwards. And your arguments against God came after your decision to not want God. And I don't want God is not an argument. It's just a response. So now that we've got all that out there, can I give you the good news? The good news is when we acknowledge that the issue is our resistance, not God's existence, we're ready to take a step back to God. And when we recognize that, oh boy, we may actually be wrong, and we may actually be accountable, and we may actually be guilty, you're exactly where you need to be to hear the greatest message you could ever hear. In fact, a guy in the first century who spent the better part of his life trying to imprison Christians and then saw Jesus after the resurrection and decided to follow Jesus said, this. But God demonstrates his what? His judgment, his anger, his hatred? No, his own love for us in this. While we were still guilty, accountable, and wrong, sinners. Not mistakers, not nobody's perfect, not, well, other people are worse, but while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Now, I know the argument of the new atheist today is, well, why all the blood and the gore, and why did anybody have to die? And here's why. Because God wants to enter into a relationship with us, and relationships that are worthwhile involve sacrifice. And God gave of his only Son to pay a penalty that we deserved because we are guilty, and we are accountable, and we are wrong, because we are sinners. And it's because of that Christ died for us. I mean, do you really want to live the rest of your life outside of that gift? To resist God is to resist this great news. This makes sense of so much in our life. This makes sense of all the oughts in our life. That thing inside of you that goes, well, they ought not do that, and they shouldn't do that, and that shouldn't have happened, and they ought to do this, and they ought to do that, and why doesn't God do this, and where does that come from? It comes from this thing wired in us that knows right from wrong, that understands that there is some kind of justice that needs to happen in the world, and it's because of this that we need a judge that's overseeing all of it. And God says, that's me. And I allowed my Son to pay your penalty. You see, the reality is, if the question is simply this, who wants God? Let's be really honest. At some point, none of us. Because we don't want to be guilty or accountable or wrong. But if the question is, who needs God? As it turns out, all of us. We've talked about this before, but in case you didn't know, Jesus actually had some brothers and sisters. And we call them half-brothers and sisters because Jesus' father was God, and mother was Mary, and his half-brothers and sisters, their parents were Mary and Joseph. And none of them believed in Jesus. I mean, they believed he existed. They just didn't believe he was the Son of God because he's a brother. I mean, what would it take for your brother to convince you he's the Son of God, you know? So they didn't believe. And Jesus does all these miracles and builds this great following, and they're all kind of on the outside looking in going, guy's a kook. They think he's crazy. They would look at him like we looked at David Koresh. And they're thinking, this guy's nuts. Until he died and came back from the dead. And then suddenly they believed. And they go to him and they basically say, I'm sorry, I didn't believe you. And they make things right with Jesus. And one of these brothers is a guy by the name of James who writes this letter to some of the churches in the first century. And it's actually been preserved over the centuries and is in our Bible now towards the end of it. It's just a short little letter there that is a very creative title. It's called James. So this little letter, and you really ought to sit down and just read this for a few minutes. It's amazing. But it's written by the half-brother of Jesus. And here's a guy who spent the better part of his life never believing in Jesus and then chose to believe in him. And if there's anybody who can tell us how to get things right with God, for those of us who have stepped away from faith to find out how to come back, it's him. And here's what he says. Submit yourselves. You see that position of humility? Just own it. Just own it to God. Resist the devil, however you want to see that, whether it's evil personified or Satan or how, he says, listen, just resist that and he'll flee from you. Come near to God and what? He'll be angry. He'll run you away. He'll punish you. No, he'll come near to you. And then he continues with this idea of just this humility thing. Wash your hands, you sinners. Just own it. Own who you are. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, and wail. Change your laughter to mourning, your joy to gloom. Here's what he's saying. I had to come clean with Jesus and go, I missed it, and I'm sorry, but I believe. Here's what he says will happen. Humble yourselves before the Lord. And what? He will condemn you. He will cast you out of his sight. He'll remind you of how you got it wrong. No, he will lift you up. That's what it means to come back to faith. When our girls were a lot younger, my second daughter, Sydney, was about probably 2.5. And we're walking out of the house one day, and we had to walk through the kind of the laundry room there, by the garage. And my wife had sorted out all the clothes because it was laundry day, and we're doing laundry. And we go into the laundry room because we're going to walk out into the garage, and someone has gone in there and just mixed up all the clothes. It's just a mess. And Lori looks at the clothes and she goes, who did this? And Sydney, 2.5 years old, said, I did it, and I did it on purpose. That's what it means to come back to God. I did it. I'm wrong. I'm accountable. I'm guilty. And to be honest, I did it on purpose. But now I'm coming back. I want to ask you, would you take that step? Would you just bow your heads and close your eyes for just a second? Wherever you are, whether you're in Valencia, Canyon Country, watching online, just bow your heads and close your eyes for a second. And I just want to give you a moment to take that step back to God. Not the step back to, I know everything. Not everything makes sense to me. Not, I believe with no reservations. But you know what? There is a God. And I'm committed to figuring out the answers. I'm committed to pursuing him rather than just not wanting to. I want to just put that argument aside. And I want to know God. If that's where you are right now and you're ready to take that step back towards faith, not admitting you'll be perfect, not admitting you understand everything, not even admitting you believe everything, but you're ready to take that next step back, would you just, wherever you are, with every head bowed, every eye closed, would you just raise your hand right now, just kind of mark that moment. Say, God, I'm in. I am humbling myself before you. And I want to know you. Father, I thank you for all those hands raised. Here, Canyon Country, all over the world right now online. As we just take steps back to you, we have a lot of questions. But we admit, part of the reason we walked away is just because we didn't want you. But God, we know we need you. We need you. And we are so grateful that you are a God that is loving and kind and gracious and welcomes us back. And right now, we just want to take a few moments to remember what Jesus did for us so we could be free. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.